This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Roger Scruton the republication of his famous book, Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, Thinkers of the New Left. Roger Scruton is no stranger to Liberty Law Talk. We've interviewed him on his book, How to Be a Conservative, and also his recent novel, The Disappeared. He is the author of numerous books. I've mentioned a few of his most recent ones. Also his book, England, an Elegy, and The Soul of the World, recent books that have had a tremendous impact. Roger, glad to have you on the program.
I'm very glad to be back. Thank you.
So, Roger, this book, Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, first was published over 30 years ago in the United Kingdom by an academic publisher, Longman's. And it's fair to say that the controversy which erupted from the book's publication changed the course of your academic career. You report on having to flee a public lecture at the threat of violence. Longman's actually decided not to keep publishing the book under numerous denunciations it was receiving and letters it was receiving from academics. As I read the book, you try and understand the essence, the philosophical core of leftist thinking in the academy in Europe. And you do that, I think, incredibly well. I think that testifies to the controversy you received. But, maybe just talk about here at the beginning what you're saying in the book, what you're arguing, and also just talk about how it, the controversy really did change your career and your life.
Right. Well, yes, I had been in the university world when I wrote this for about, I guess, getting on for 20 years, and living through that period in the 70s and the early 80s, when the ideas of 1968 were filtering through the academy in Britain, always a little bit later than in France. But the thinkers like Foucault and Althusser and Deleuze and so on that were gradually being accepted as the center of a new curriculum, a curriculum that would be devoted to the cause of liberation and equality and the undermining of traditional institutions, the university itself included. And I had to teach in the London University while this was happening, and was, to be quite honest, quite appalled by it, by the pure negativity of it. That's the thing that has always struck me about the left, that although it pretends to be idealistic and aiming towards a new and utopian order of things, it's precisely the utopianism that appeals, because that means you're really defining yourself negatively. You're saying that I'm against this, I'm against that, I'm against this because it stands in the way of utopia, but knowing, of course, that utopia is a nowhere. And this relentless negativity that was changing the curriculum and the mode of argument and the texts that were being studied rather got me down, I have to say. So one by one, I picked on these thinkers and wrote little articles about them in the Salisbury Review, which I edited. Then I gathered them all together, polished them up a bit. I tried to be fair to these guys because some of them are very brilliant. Foucault and Sartre, for example. Anyway, it was published as a book, and I made the attempt in the book to get to the essence of it, to say exactly what the left is, to explore this negativity and try and state an alternative, saying, look, this isn't actually all that we've got, that there is something else. There is what I call the right, which is the defense of settled institutions, forms of life that we've inherited, private property and all the institutions that go with it, and the rule of law. And of course, I was very conscious at the time of the communist alternative, which had been created by the left. And because I visited those countries and tried to help people, I was also very indignant about the sufferings that had resulted from that. So there was quite a bit of passion in the book as a result. Then it was published, and immediately this furore. I was essentially excommunicated from my college and the university, and most appalling reviews and articles were written about it. As you said, the publisher received these kind of poison pen letters from academics saying that you've disgraced yourself. If you want to be rehabilitated in the eyes of the great and the good and become a respectable publisher again, you better break off all relations with that peculiar man, which they duly did. And I realized then that my own career was never going to advance very far in the university world, given what the damage that this book had done. But it didn't worry me that because I was planning to leave the university anyway. I had got fed up with the orthodoxies and the sheer bigotry of everything. So I put it on one side, the book. It was remaindered, and I thought that I'll try and live this down. I'll write something else. And I set out on my literary career, and it was all disappeared into the past. But then a new publisher wanted to reissue it in a new version. That's Bloomsbury, and I thought, well, should I? I started doing so, started rewriting it, and my wife said, no, you can't go through that again. And I said, well, the world has changed. Why don't we give it a try? And eventually she conceded, and I rewrote the book, included a few new thinkers like Badiou and Zizek, and off it went to the publisher. And, of course, as I anticipated, it's all been very quietly received. The left no longer engages in that kind of belligerence. Not that it's changed, not that people on the left have come to believe anything else. It's that they've come to believe nothing.
No, you mentioned, I read an interview you gave in The Guardian upon publication of the book, which I thought was quite nice. The controversy of the book. So you weren't in effect dismissed from the university, but you knew that you would never rise up to higher levels of status or standing within your college.
Well, no, I was a professor by then, okay. Full professor, so there was nothing that they could do to me, but it was nevertheless
isolating.
One was isolated and regarded as peculiar. And this is a very interesting thing because it's not as though Britain is unique in this respect. Some recent research in America suggests that only 10% of American academic staff identify themselves as conservative, even though, the majority of the American people do. And this is a very interesting thought, that somehow the universities move of their own accord in this left-wing direction, and it's not just that people in the universities happen to have left-wing views, it's that they propagate those views and regard them as part of the purpose of the intellectual life. That's the thing that most disturbed me when I wrote the book, that political views at that time, and I think today as well, were not seen simply as views that someone might have who was nevertheless a scholar in Egyptology or formal logic or whatever, but they were regarded as the necessary outcome of being an intellectual in the first place. And, obviously as a conservative, I rejected that. I see politics as something that is only one stream in life, and not something about which one has to be dogmatic just because one is the world expert on Kant's transcendental deduction.
You've mentioned this book, the controversy, led to a period of doubting in your life, and one of the ways you dealt with that, which is not hard. I mean, one can be reasonably certain that you're right on issues, and that feeling of isolation is very difficult to deal with. One of the ways you dealt with it, you went to the countryside. You also started teaching in America. Two things. So the teaching in America gave you the time and the leisure to go to the countryside. Maybe talk about that. How did that contribute to the sort of the flowering and just ever multiplying array of books and articles you've produced since?
Well, I see a lot of the problems that I'd had came about because I also had pursued a career as a writer and journalist, and had written a regular column in the Times, which was essentially a satirical column about left-wing thinking. And it's very important to recognize that people on the left cannot stand being laughed at. It's deadly serious in the same way as feminism is today, or Islamism. These are joke-free zones. So I wasn't very popular anyway, but I'd also thought at the time, well, why don't I pursue a career as a writer and see if I can make that work, and then I can just be free of the university forever and not care what people think about my views. So that's one thing that I decided to do. As you say, I did teach in America for a bit, but only a part-time job, so that I could be there for one semester and then pursue my writing. And so that's the reason why so many books have come out. That was what I've been doing, and I settled in the country because of love of hunting and horses and all that. So I changed career essentially in about I suppose it would have been about 1993, I'm no longer an academic. Let's face it. I'm a writer who sometimes pops up in a university as a curiosity.
So if we think about the thinkers that you have written about in Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, so we've got the British historian Hobsbawm, another British thinker, E.M. Thompson, as well as an American figure, Galbraith, also a British philosopher who writes a lot about American constitutional law and trying to make it come out in support of the emancipated individual, Ronald Dworkin, as well as Sartre and Foucault. And then German thinker Habermas, who has now become in many respects the court philosopher of the European Union. Maybe we can talk about him a little bit. You talk about, though, at the beginning of the book, if we try and understand the essence or the form of these thinkers, according to your book, we can. Two thinkers that stand out, Karl Marx and Hegel, or maybe Hegel and Marx. And then maybe I should mention a third, a Russian philosopher who teaches in Paris, Alexander Kojev. Outlined their influence, though, on all of these thinkers, which I take to be fundamental in the sense of, I think it's largely the way you talk about Hegel and Marx and the interplay there, and how that sort of contributes in their minds to thinking about, or in terms of these more contemporary thinkers, emancipation of the individual from structures of domination. And I suppose that contributes in many respects to this endless negativity you mentioned earlier.
Yes. Yeah, well, this is a very interesting line of inquiry. I'm a great admirer of Hegel, who set the agenda, really, of modern philosophy, or at least some kind of modern philosophy, through his fundamental insight that the free individual comes into being only through social interaction. You're not a free individual, as Rousseau thought, in the state of nature. You're not born free. You become free through your encounter with the other, and it's through that dialectical relation with other people that you come to full consciousness of yourself. Now, Hegel did not use that argument in order to generate left-wing conclusions. On the contrary, he was a very profound conservative thinker who recognized that once you see things in this way, you are committed to the reality of institutions, that people become fully individuals only if they are also fully part of a community, protected by institutions, corporations, legal identities, and so on, of the kind that conservatives wish to conserve. So he used this argument very much in a positive way to affirm what he thought was emerging in the Germany of his day. Whereas Marx picked it up and used it negatively in order to say that, look, we're not full free individuals, because we're alienated in these circumstances, and the real heart of Marxist thinking is this theory of the alienation of not just of the worker, but the alienation of all people under the free capitalist economy, which he didn't regard as free, he regarded as a kind of oppression. And so he turned Hegel's argument upside down, and the dispute between them is still of immense relevance and interest to us, and one could see it as something of great philosophical importance, regardless of one's particular political views. But then along came Alexander Kojève, who was a Russian exile from Stalin's Russia, but who declared himself actually to be a Stalinist, and was later thought by the French security apparatus to be a Russian spy, actually a member of the NKVD and everything. But anyway, he ended up giving lectures in I think the Collège de France in Paris, which were attended before the Second World War, by just about every French intellectual, in which he explained this great argument about the other, how the self needs the other, and that our world divides into those things which contribute to our freedom and those things in which the otherness of everything resides. So he shaped this argument so it could be used in all sorts of exciting ways to undermine institutions, reject inheritances, and so on. And you find this idea immediately dominating French culture, French philosophical life after the Second World War, with what's her name, de Beauvoir, Sartre's other half, with her theory of the woman as the other, and Levinas with his idea of the face as the revelation of the other. Sartre, in all his post-war writings about the otherness of the individual under capitalism, and so on. There is a very interesting intellectual input which needs to be deciphered, and a lot of what I'm trying to do in the book is to decipher this and show how it is in fact a kind of sleight of hand, a way of turning Hegel against himself, and that if one truly understood what Hegel had been trying to get at, you would see that all these left-wing conclusions were the opposite of what the argument implies.
So, I mean, there's several interesting lines of inquiry, I think, here in America that we could pursue coming out of this Hegelian cornerstone of your book. One thing that comes to mind in terms of an academic counter-response to progressivism in America, Hegel is actually the great boogeyman. Hegel is actually the one who sets forth a understanding of government institutions as being evolutionary, as unlocking people from various forms of, I won't say oppression, but of a need to get beyond, say, something like separation of powers, which is, of course, a key part of American constitutional thinking. And so those who have written on American progressivism always say, well, it starts with Woodrow Wilson, who's the first American PhD at Johns Hopkins, or in America, period, studies at Johns Hopkins University, where they learn German political philosophy. I mean, I'm sure you know all this. And Hegel is kind of the one who, kind of this idea of history has a moving target, moving us to higher levels of understanding, and so we actually have a better science of government now, and we want to actually unleash the power of government to liberate individuals in certain respects. You say there's a conservative Hegel. I think that would be worthy in this discussion to hear from you on what that is.
Yes, well, I've always thought, and there are two Hegels. I mean, there is this progressivist Hegel who thought of that history is always moving in towards more emancipation, more self-consciousness, more grasp of the human condition, until finally arriving at complete liberation. And that romantic idea, which is pure utopianism, survives in Marx and in many 19th century left-wing thinkers. But as I say, I don't think that is one aspect of Hegel. But in his book, The Philosophy of Right, in which he addresses the concrete questions of political thinking, it's all going the other way. It's all about how human individuals do realize their freedom only through their relations with others and through the institutions that mediate those relations. He gives a profound defense of property, of the rule of law, of the need for corporations and corporate personality, of the need for the family as the place in which the individual emerges as a conscious unit, and so on. All things which conservatives have wanted to defend in our time and have found themselves quite without arguments often when confronted by the sort of emancipatory doctrines on the left. So I feel that Hegel obviously can be interpreted in lots of ways. He had a terrible influence on Woodrow Wilson, but Woodrow Wilson would have been badly influenced by anything he read, even Shakespeare, I should think.
I like that. Thinking about the Kojève and that chapter on his influence on the set of thinkers you profile, my sort of simple, practical American insight into this is he is in effect preaching that man can become a god, or that we can become little gods, defining or creating new realities, new language, modes of expression. We can exist on our own terms, and in that way we'll be equal, and we will usher in a new creation or a new reality. I mean, that's the way. I read that in terms of a spiritual hunger. He is providing. He is providing something to these minds who desperately want a way of meaning, and there it is, right there in this sort of new interpretation.
Yeah, well, Kojève, I don't really emphasize him too much, but you have to remember he's responsible for the whole, if you like, vulgarization of Hegel's end of history doctrine, and he was the big influence on Frank Fukuyama in his book on that topic, so that he's,
yes.
which is often regarded with endorsement by many on the right, not many conservative thinkers. But you're right that at the heart of all this traditional leftist thinking is the hunger for a religion, a sense of the need for something that will replace those absolutes that religion provides, the framework within which the individual life can be led, which will be a framework of consolation and redemption, and utopia is the only thing that, in the end, the left can provide by way of filling that God-shaped hole. But that's another way of not filling it, because utopia is, by definition, emptiness.
Yeah, you said at the beginning. This is interesting. You said the left in Europe believes in nothing. Talk about nothing. That's interesting to me because when I look at Europe, that's a lot of American conservatives look at Europe. We look at, say, the migration crisis. Maybe get your thoughts on that. The migration crisis that's been going on now for close to 2 years in Europe. The ways in which it seems to be looked at by European leaders as they almost have a responsibility to bring in people from another civilization without regard to consequences. And that does sort of spark to mind that, well, what is the European Union for? What's it about? What's its foundation? What's its project? And collective understanding of itself going forward. Habermas is a thinker you've profiled here. He tried to provide an answer that, if I remember, during the second Bush presidency, that was very much a negative answer. It seemed to be anti to everything America stood for, but I guess that just brings to mind this sort of question of the left believes in nothing. It's had the cultural high ground, as you profile in this book now, for decades, and I suppose we can ask the question of what does it all mean now, or what has it meant? What's the legacy of that going forward?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right that we do see the legacy of this nihilism in the European Union. There is a nothingness at the heart of the European Union political machine, in that there are no values on which anything is based, accept a kind of repudiation of our inherited culture. If it's ours, reject it. That's the basic premise from which everything emerges. When it comes to spiritual values or values connected with the family and reproduction, these are all again negated. There's no provisions are made for these things. Of course, we're allowed as private individuals to pursue the eccentric path of old-fashioned heterosexuals, but that isn't something that has any endorsement from the political institutions. All is negative. All is returned to the individual to make what he can of it. Of course, this does mean that when it comes to these great crises like the migration crisis, it's always the others who have the advantage. There's nothing in the European the European institutions that enables people to say, look, hang on, this is our place. We are managing this according to our traditions, our customs, our laws, and these are the things you've got to obey, and you've got to show a complete willingness to adapt. And nobody's ever said that to the incoming communities. And of course, the result is that the Muslims among them don't adapt. They find themselves eventually surrounded by an alien civilization, and many of the younger ones want to take revenge on it.
Yes.
This is a consequence of the emptiness at the heart of European civilization as it is today.
Thinking about the dominance within the European Academy, which is also in many respects replicated in the American Academy, in the humanities, what we're seeing in America, as I'm sure you're aware, is fewer and fewer students wanting to take humanities degrees. Of course, one explanation for that is a practical one, and very, very much geared towards finding a place for yourself in a capitalist society. And there are all sorts of ways to do that seem more direct than humanities degrees, although I would question that even. But in many respects, I think the answer is, what is the humanities, or what is the study of the humanities about now? Given that we've had a couple of generations of this sort of thinking, and so you're talking about the beginning, your teaching career, and I take it it's not only you being required to teach new thinkers or different thinkers, and so there being no idea of what constitutes an education or being an educated gentleman or woman anymore, but it's also the ways in which I suppose Aristotle is taught, or Plato or Shakespeare, other thinkers that come to mind. I mean, these are taught according to and sort of, or within the language of domination, of things that we get beyond and move beyond. Maybe they had something, they're a product of forces, et cetera, but now the focus is to create or to emancipate. It's something like that.
Yeah, it's a very complicated matter, but what I think is what has principally changed is that instead of criticism, we have historical explanation as the heart of the humanities. But as I was brought up in the university in the 60s in Cambridge, I read philosophy, so that was not a straight humanity. It was half and half. But in English, for example, you were taught to confront a text and with a critical intelligence, find out what it means, evaluate it as an object of aesthetic interest, in the way that you might, a Shakespeare play. So, what does it say? What is it saying about humanity? And does it say it well? How does the imagery work? And what are the beauties of this thing? So that kind of direct critical approach was replaced bit by bit with a political explanation. What is Shakespeare really assuming about the position of men versus women? What kind of what are the relations, as you say, what are the relations of domination that we can perceive in the language and the characters and the situation and always with a view to negating what you're studying, to say, that we're emancipating ourselves from that. We can now reject it. We're moving on to the next stage of liberation. And the result of this method, which it can be done using the tools provided by Foucault or those provided by Marx or those provided by the feminists, but however you do it, the net result is alienation from the inherited works of art and literature of our civilization. So inevitably, studying the humanities becomes a way of rejecting them.
And yeah, exactly. And thinking about the study of the humanities and maybe broadening it out to is the overall academic university life in defending the great cultural inheritance of the West for students and in publications. In thinking about your book and these thinkers so dominant, Foucault so dominant, particularly in a lot of disciplines. I remember being at a graduate student conference, a young woman, very talented, from California, Berkeley, kept speaking and referencing Foucault. None of us could understand her really, and I think that's because she was speaking in Foucaultian terms. But one could see how he has shaped the minds of graduate students and really shaped disciplines and thinking. But all of that, it comes down to a basic question for me. And I know there are institutional reasons and incentives and all sorts of explanations here. But why is it proven so difficult, particularly in the English-speaking countries, to produce a defense of civil society, rule of law, limited government, markets, the value of religion, even if one is not personally religious, all of this sort of business? It's very thin. You noted a study at the beginning. It's a very thin defense. America has kind of a think tank apparatus alongside of it, but that's very political, even though it was conservative and libertarian. But within the academy itself, a very weak defense, a very weak counter to all of this. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Why?
I wish I knew why. Obviously, it's very much easier to impress young people if you relay to them a message of emancipation. If you're relaying a message of obedience, which is essentially what culture should be about, obedience to an inherited form of life, then you're bound, to score less marks with them. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't listen to you, but you've got to be able to present it in such a way that they see that, yes, indeed, that is what human life is about. So they have to start from an attitude of deference. We have a culture which has gradually or rapidly jettisoned the whole idea of deference. Young people come to university already persuaded that they are in charge. It's their opinion that counts. They're not, they shouldn't, they're under no obligation to humble themselves in the face of some aged professor whose views they don't accept. And so the habit of not listening to any alternative has already been implanted in them. And it means that, of course, to appeal to them is much easier if you've got a left-wing message. Because then you're promising them further emancipation, go further down this road that you're already embarked on, so that there's an incentive to adopt this left-wing curriculum, and it's very hard for the older professors who go the other way. The Blooms of this world and. They've become very isolated, often curmudgeonly and embittered, and which doesn't help their case, I don't know that the atmosphere then of the university changes from one of deferential scholarship to a sort of frivolous partying.
Yeah, in many respects, though, it seems like what you're saying, could be saying, is so the overall effect of what Marx does with Hegel, and then sort of the flowering out into a lot of these more foundational 20th century thinkers is sort of something that someone captured, I think, nicely with the expression, the hermeneutics of suspicion. And they say that everything that we see around us, every institution we see around us, is in no respect an attempt to mediate some sort of truth or goodness. It's an outcome of power. It's a product of a particular domination. And so there's nothing that I would necessarily be deferential to or pietistic about, because I am in fact, trying to create something that will surpass what I've been given.
That's all part of it, and it's very difficult to know how to counter this. You see, our universities, when they were really beginning to flower in the 18th and 19th centuries, they still had their religious inheritance. They had grown out of monastic institutions, and were theology and religious rituals and attendance at divine services and all those sort of things were simply an accepted part of university life. So university life was seen as a tangential to the religious life, and that disappeared during the course of the 19th century, and for a while people retained, nevertheless, this sense of the holiness and the spiritual authority of the university curriculum. But as soon as the power hunger and all that got going, it was swept away almost at once, and that's, I think, what happened in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, that's interesting. Interesting thought. On that in that regard. So if we think about Europe now, and I often kind of appeal to this phrase of Pierre Manot's, or this observation of post-familial, post-religious, post-political, and the result has been not some sort of a republic of conscience, but it's been weakness, and it's been a Europe of weakness. And interesting sorts of, we've touched upon the migration crisis. Where do you see sort of all of this right now? Is there some sort of crisis inflection point? Do you see people returning in small, maybe very small creative minorities, rethinking what they've been given, or actually trying to return to great text, great books to understand the human condition anew?
Well, I think that when institutions become rotten, it's very difficult to revive them. And I think our universities and their humanities departments in particular are rotten. And that really one has to start new things, new forms of education, new ways in which people can remind themselves of their culture and revive it and make a contribution to it. So I think private universities in the model of the American Liberal Arts College are what we need. And there are a few moves in that direction in Britain, only a few. But, of course, in Germany or somewhere like that, the idea of doing anything without the rubber stamp of the state is unheard of. And it's really in Germany that the rebirth is needed. But there, as you say, the spirit of German culture today is exemplified perfectly by Habermas, a sort of dithering, bureaucratic nothingness, which goes on for page after page with every possible reference to every possible source, avoiding any possible conclusion.
On this thinking, and just sort of thinking about the 20th century in Europe broadly, two massive world wars which destroyed the continent. You had a return to prosperity rather quickly. I mean, it's amazing how quickly Europe returned to prosperity. And the Christian Democratic Party is key there. And then you have you have the return to prosperity, but you get consumer culture, mass culture. I think you would agree with me. There's something not quite right about that, even though the standards of living are wonderful and we appreciate all of that. There is something unsettling about all of that. That's part of what we haven't, we've been touching on a few of the thinkers. The Frankfurt School is providing this sort of deep systematic critique of consumer culture. But if we link, it's sort of thinking about, or maybe trying to give these thinkers the best possible light. Europe does seem to its major foundations and institutions and ideas seem to fail. in the 20th century in many ways. And that, of course, makes it very easy to critique them. They, the nation state pathological. Look at World War I. Religion doesn't really seem to offer much resistance. Seems to be very weak in terms of providing meaning for people. We have prosperity, but look what it leads to. It's certainly not a deep cultural interaction for people. All sorts of these critiques. The family. We can all think about how maybe the family in certain respects can be stifling, and emancipation's fun to think about.
Yeah.
So all of that going on there, yet. But the conclusion being to wipe all of that away and replace it with what? We never get around to thinking deeply about that. Just a lot of abstract writing there.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right that the Frankfurt School, which grew out of Lukács and Adorno and people like that from very early on in the 20th century, was a reaction really to not just to the First World War, but to the paradox of modern capitalism. That here is a society in which everybody, a society of abundance, in which consumption is the preoccupation of everyone, and yet it's unable to provide the spiritual resources that people need when emergencies come, or which they need in their private lives and in their love relations and so on. And so this developed into this passionate criticism of consumerism and commodity fetishism, to use Marx's term, which dominated German thinking after the Second World War as well, during the course of their recovery to an enormous level of prosperity. And the growth of the welfare state, which removed from everybody the need really to make any provisions for himself. All that went with a sense that it didn't mean anything. And so the criticism of capitalism that Marx had begun with, which was a criticism on behalf of the poor and the dispossessed, was turned on its head. Capitalism was criticized for what it did to the wealthy, which were all of us. How it removed, it puts the desire to consume in the place of the understanding of life as an end in itself, and so that it was really a religious criticism of the abundance of the material abundance of our societies, which has turned us away from the salvation of our souls. But of course, it wasn't put in that way by the Frankfurt School. And when it comes to the soulless prose of Habermas, you can't even imagine it being put in that way.
On this point, thinking about a systematic critique of capitalism, it alienates us from our true nature, our true essence, our true creative selves. And we're the term, use the term, you don't use the term, but you talk about the term reification in the Frankfurt School, whereby our best self becomes located in the objects of technology and consumerism, all of this sort of business. Thinking now, though, about Europe and where Europe could go from here, economically, politically, socially. That's a huge question. But there has to be, at a certain point, there has to be a realization that, as you talk about, mediation has to be reattempted. Mediation of individuals within families, mediation in terms of a new defense of politics, a new defense of limited government. And the term I keep coming back to is one that you use, which is compromise and agreement and mediation. All of that sort of business. Where does that come from, though? It's a remembering, but it's a remembering that seems so incredibly difficult, just given what you have talked about in this book in terms of the deep attempt to transform the European mind, which in many respects has succeeded.
Yeah, well, I'm in this book, I'm much more concerned with criticizing the negativity of the left than in providing an alternative. Though in the last chapter, I do try and say something about the importance of law and institutions and an educational and cultural tradition. But I would say that that for that to be rediscovered and reanimated, we must first of all rediscover and reanimate the nation state. That's what Europe achieved, what you still have in America, and what the European Union set out to destroy on the false assumption that it was the nation state that had caused the war. It wasn't the nation state as an institution, it was a particular nation state, namely Germany, which had fallen into the power of a bunch of madmen. We have to be much more truthful about that and about our history, and recognize that the confiscation of national borders and national identities by the European Union was a terrible mistake. If that mistake could be undone, then each country, I think, would have the ability still, and we've seen this in France, to revive itself, to say, look, we are what we are, and we're not going to accept being imposed upon in this way, and we're going to defend ourselves. There's going to be some major conflicts, as we know, but the European people will only be in a position to fight those battles if they have rediscovered their separate identities. And I'm confident that there will be a move in that direction.
It's almost, though, when I think about your book, so if we think about the dominant spiritual power in these thinkers, which is sort of giving you a license to act, or a freedom to create, a freedom to make something new again, to make the world new. But maybe really the paradoxical result of all of that, or maybe not paradoxical, is sort of a paralysis, an inability to act, an inability to think, because you start to take this on. I am so put upon. I am so pick however the descriptive term, and it's actually rediscovering the freedom to act politically that Europe most needs to recover. I suppose that's what you're saying.
Yes, I mean, there is no freedom to act at the moment because all the major decisions are in the hands of unelected bureaucrats who are inaccessible to the people of Europe. We're allowed, to do small local things to cheer ourselves up. But the idea of actually saying, getting up and saying, look, I'm going to repossess my country and make it my own, which is what Americans can do all the time. That's something that's been taken from us.
Yeah. Your thoughts briefly here as we end on the upcoming British vote. I think it's in 2017, so a while away, on will Britain exit the European Union and recover this own sense of, it's never been exactly a full-fledged member, but would in fact be separate from it. Your thoughts on that, how that might play out?
Well, my thoughts here are that I hope that it happens, but of course it's very touch and go whether it will happen. Obviously the government, or certainly David Cameron, does not want it to happen because that would leave him with the real difficulty that he'll have at last to be obliged to govern. It's great for someone to enjoy all the privileges of a prime minister and have all the responsibilities handed on to someone else. And that's one reason why the European Union endures. It's a wonderful holiday for politicians. But I think it's quite possible that we will exit because, after all, by then the European Union will be in such crisis with the migration thing and with all the conflicts that we've seen emerging over the euro, the Greek economy, the Spanish economy, and so on, that maybe people will say, look, we've had enough of this. Let's set off again on our own and be what we were. Let's see.
Yeah, I suppose it seems to be the biggest public argument we'll hear will be the loss of trade if Britain exits. That seems that will be made over and over again.
Absolutely, but European Union is only it's not even a half of our trade, our international trade, and of course trade exists because people want your product.
Why that would change?
Yeah, and that they won't cease to want our product just because we're not part of the European Union. And anyway, you Americans, you're our friends. You'll buy all our rubbish anyway, won't you?
Perhaps. Roger, thank you so much for your time today. We've been talking with Roger Scruton about his book, Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.